here's the big question. Is atheism the downfall of nations? Okay, so I reviewed a video. Actually, I reviewed several videos made by a person who calls himself Holy Koolaid. Holy Koolaid's real name is Thomas Westbrook, and he is a big atheist advocate. And so what Thomas did is he decided he was going to take a snapshot of time from the year 2009, compare a bunch of economic indicators to whether or not a country was claiming to be religious, and to make the determination of if the country was claiming to be religious, that it was speaking to the economic indicators. What he found in his analysis was that religious countries tended to have a poor economic indicators, whereas the non-religious countries, the secular countries, tended to be faring better. However, I found some flaws in his assessments. In fact, I found numerous flaws in his assessments. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to show you a clip. Actually, I'm going to show you most of Thomas's video on from Holy Koolaid on these is atheism the downfall of nations. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you some substantial reasons based on substantial research that's been done over the decades, over the centuries actually, into our history on exactly what is the true picture. Rather than taking a snapshot of time from the year 2009, I'm going to do much more. Okay, so I'm not going to give you that quick assessment of one snapshot in time on how the rich and the poor are faring, because essentially that's really the distinction that Thomas was able to make. He had rich countries versus poor countries, and he tried to attribute the fact that the poor countries were 98, 99% religious to the reason that they were poor. I mean, it's actually almost a little bit crazy. And so we're going to talk about some much more significant things. This speaks to what my PhD is in. Actually, it's right in my wheelhouse. What I've been studying since the year 2002 is countries, and I've looked at lots of country level macroeconomic indicators. I've looked at cultural indicators. I've especially focused on sociocultural issues, and I've studied a lot on this topic. And so when I read I've read a lot of different books, but when I saw Thomas's video, I cringed numerous times. And so you're going to find out why I was cringing, and my cringes were quite worthy. His video was worthy of much cringe. And Thomas, just to tell you who he is an atheist. I encountered him a few years ago. He's been in a lot of different places. I saw him one time at the Faithless Forum get up on stage and sort of do a pep rally on the value of atheism and what these people can do to promote their atheism. And so Thomas is doing that himself. He has a YouTube channel. He's an activist YouTuber, and he has apparently about 117,000 subscribers. So he far exceeds my number of subscribers. So we're going to go and take a look at what Thomas initially is saying here, and then I'm going to offer some significant refutations. And so be sure to hang on here, because that's what we're going to do. So let me just swoop over, and we're going to take a look. Whoops, I just swooped over a little too quickly. Okay, so we're going to look at is atheism, and we're going to look at Thomas's take on this matter. So you're going to see him in one moment. Here he is. This is a 00 mark. I did not purposely intend for Thomas to be making a strange expression here, but this is where he's starting his video. And so we're going to take a listen here. So let's hear what he has to say. Now, to preface this, it sounds like Thomas might be from Texas. It sounds like he was raised in a fundamentalist Christian family. It sounds like his parents had some very fundamentalist ideas. And it seems to me I probably could say he doesn't agree with them. Possibly he started disagreeing as a child. I don't know, but here we go.
Are religious countries better off than non-religious countries? Does atheism inevitably end in disastrous, corrupt, authoritarian ruin? When I was religious, there was a sentiment I heard echoed on the regular, that God blesses countries which follow him and makes them thrive and prosper.
There are promises in Scripture that when a nation will put him first and will honor him as the God of the land, he will make that nation great.
But curses nations which stray from the faith.
And when the nation or individual people have rejected the word of the Lord God, God will begin to withdraw his blessing. And that's why we have the problems that we have.
But is any of this true? Does the data support this? Well, in this video, we'll be taking a look at 20 of the most religious and 20 of the least religious countries and analyzing how they rank on 10 different indicators of development and success to see if countries that become more secular really are doomed to poverty, misery, and failure.
I want to point out something that Thomas did here. Now, Thomas is assessing 20 of the most religious and 20 of the least religious. Excluded from his analysis are two significant contributors to these economic indicators, China and the United States. And so he has excluded China because he says he didn't have full data for the year 2009. He's excluded the United States because he says only 65% of people in the United States are Christian, and therefore he's going to exclude the United States from the analysis. He only wanted to focus on the top 20 countries, which tend to be the poorest countries, typically located in the African region. And so Thomas is going to basically use this assessment to try to make an overall view. And that itself is a flawed assessment. If you're going to fully analyze exactly what's going on, you should really look at not just the top 20 and the bottom 20. You want to take a look at the whole picture. That's what a statistical analysis typically would do. But let's go.
Hi, it's Sam Barker here from the Motley Fool. Behind me is
Okay, got a little Motley Fool. That's
Landmark Mall.
targeted harassment. No, just kidding. That's targeted things because I've actually been looking at stresses. Okay, stocks, I should say. Here we go.
Before I dive in, I want to announce my new Discord server. I'm hoping it can be a fun online community where I can get to know y'all better. You can hang out with me, talk about recent and upcoming videos and video ideas, share memes, articles, podcasts, and so much more. More info at the end of this video.
Okay, and I'll definitely give Thomas credit. I've also done a link to his video in case he happens to come over here. Now, just to note something, to be a little bit proactive here, I asked Thomas a couple of times on Twitter. I tweeted to him whether he would like to join me in this video. He didn't respond. I also got onto the video and I went into comments and also asked him if he would like to join me in making commentary about this video. And he didn't respond. And so I'm assuming that Thomas did not want to make commentary. I actually checked his Twitter. Apparently he was on Twitter. He was interacting after I asked him. And how did I discover his video in the first place? Well, Jen with one N, she's a woman who lives up in upstate New York. She sent me the video as a response to certain things I was posting on Twitter. And so we're going to get into this. It's going to take a little while today to unpack. But I'm also going to let Thomas offer his, of course, his Discord server, any other promotions. Go ahead and if you want to like and subscribe to his stuff, you can do that by clicking on the video in the description. But here we go.
In 2009, Gallup asked thousands of people in 114 different countries the yes or no question, is religion an important part of your daily life? While the results aren't a perfect representation of religiosity levels worldwide, since the 114 countries polled is only about 3/5 of all countries in the world, this was still one of the largest, most reliable polls on religious identification ever conducted.
I want to point out something. So it's a yes or no question. Yes or no questions typically in statistics are relatively flawed. What you want to do if you want full content validity, and anyone who's watching this who is familiar with statistical practices knows that in content validity you should ask multiple questions to a particular construct. That also gives us construct validity. And you should also, the yes or no idea is not ideal because you would actually want to instead scale it. For example, on a scale of 1 to 5, how important is religious in your life? 5 being the most important, 1 being the least important. That's a much better scale to figure out where people stand in different items. And so that tends to be the proper form of statistical analysis that's used in the academic studies, the proper, again, the scale that's anchored. And so we see this a yes or no. Now, the reason why this particular idea could be flawed is because is religion an important idea in your life? Now, we don't have a preface as far as what that means exactly. How do you define important? What does important mean to me over here living in the United States versus a person living in sub-Saharan Africa? How does the level of importance vary? Does it mean you're attending religious activities once a week, once a month, or once a year? Does it mean that you are engaged in spiritual practices and that's your religion? Or does it mean that you're going to a church or a synagogue or a mosque? I mean, exactly how is this defined? That is the big problem. So right up front, we have a bit of a possibility of a flawed study making flawed assumptions based on the statistical analyses and methodology used.
They then use the results to rank.
Okay, so let's take a look at his studies here. So look at the countries that he is focusing on. He's got the top 20. You can see right here on the left, we've got Bangladesh, Niger, Yemen, Indonesia, Malawi. Sri Lanka. We've got a lot of countries right there that have high levels of religiosity according to that particular study. And as we go down, we're going to get to the lower portion of the study where fewer people, and I'm going to keep zooming down here so we can see exactly what is going on. But you notice here the missing countries, the United States and missing China. Now he acknowledged that in another one of his videos. So here we go.
Rank the countries by religiosity. So
now he goes over these really quickly. I want to focus on Ireland. Ireland's kind of a notable exception to the rule in the area of Europe. We also have the notable exception to the rule as far as developed countries of the United States. The United States is what they would call an outlier, looking at developed countries and levels of appreciation for Christianity, for example. The countries that tend to be the least religious. Now look at the bottom of this scale here. I'm hoping that he doesn't zoom over it too quickly where we can actually see this, but you can see United Kingdom, Japan, Denmark, Sweden. You're getting the picture. So we're talking about Northern, Western European countries, and of course, Japan. So let's take a look here and see.
Let's explore the top 20 most religious and top 20 least religious countries from the.
Okay, so he's ending it at Estonia. So we've got Estonia, Sweden, Denmark, Japan, United Kingdom, and France. So the bunch of them, mainly the bigger proportion of them, with the exception of Japan, are the European countries. And so let's keep going.
Poll and see how they rank on 10 different metrics of success developed.
Okay, so these are metrics of success. This is my big problem with this particular video. Okay, so look at the metrics of success. Now, again, he's taking a snapshot in time. So I'm going to take a look. I'm going to break out here for a second, come back to you guys, and I'm going to see if you have any questions right now before we get back to Thomas's video. I want to say hi, SD. You don't see anything wrong with choosing top and bottom 20. Well, you're missing a lot of variation within the mix. You want to actually be since you have the data, since you have actually the data from over 100 countries, I think he said 114, why not include them all? Okay, if you want a true picture of what's going on, it's a better practice to include all of the data. So I'm going to take a look at, I'm going to show you my basic thesis here from what Thomas's video is. And we're going to go to that here in just a moment. So okay, so the big question Thomas is posing is atheism, the downfall of nations, okay? So we've got that big question. Now his basic thesis, here it is, countries vary as a function of their levels of religiosity around the world. That's true, right? The Christian Lord promised to protect nations that follow him. Now he identified that portion in the Bible. Now, actually we did see lots of protections for Israel, but of course, when Israel disobeyed the Lord turned away from Israel. We did see that also in the Bible. You saw that during Exodus and in other points. Numerous Christian nations in the world are impoverished, Thomas noted. Numerous secular nations are thriving. Thomas also noted that. Accordingly, God's promise of protection isn't being fulfilled. That's his basic thesis. Okay, so that's where he's coming in. Now, let me point out a few things. Religion happens to be correlated with national wealth. The correlation is high. It's statistically significant. At the P is less than 0.001 level. That's very significant. Religion was rated as relatively more important in poor masculine societies. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what that means when I say masculine. I'm referring to a cross-cultural study from a person called Gert Hofstede. Okay, religion is a factor in a much larger portrait of the institutions and societies that impact GDP per capita, corruption, and all of those other factors that Thomas cited. Okay, it's one factor in a huge, gigantic, enormous regression equation that should include multiple factors and in history. But here's what you know. So in the West, where we do see the best, the strongest, the highest levels of living, the happiest people in the West, we are based on foundations of Christianity. Christianity forms the foundation of our system. Yet our current system contains numerous offshoots from our Christian roots that speak to our condition. So in other words, I'm going to show you exactly why, according to numerous metrics, not just saying, okay, levels of religiosity mean that's why you're poor. I'm not going to say something so simplistic. I'm going to give you a much more complex and realistic view of exactly what's really going on here. So Tom Holland, who is a former agnostic, prize-winning historian, has said Christianity is the most enduring and influential legacy of the ancient world, and its emergence is the single most transformative development in Western history. Today, the West is utterly saturated by Christian assumptions, and its enduring impact can be seen in the emergence of much that has been cast as its nemesis: science, secularism, and even atheism. Christianity is the principal reason why today we think it nobler to suffer than to inflict suffering, why we assume every human life to be of equal value. Christianity transformed the world. It is the greatest story ever told. So what I am saying here is Christianity forms the foundation upon which we've built our institutions. That's what's really critical here is our institutions. Now, what are our institutions? We're talking about political, economic, and sociocultural institutions in the world, the rules of law, our democracy, this idea of the human dignity, the idea of individualism. Christianity forms that foundation. Westbrook gathered data from multiple sources, mainly representing a glimpse of modern civilization in the year 2009, to make the proposal that secular nations are thriving and religious nations are not. Among the data points he included were GDP per capita, the GINI coefficient of income inequality, corruption perceptions from Transparency International, life expectancies, average number of children, a happiness and well-being survey, and abortion rights. According to Thomas, if you have more rights to kill the unborn, you're better off. Now, of course, he and I vehemently disagree on that particular point. His conclusion is that religion and poverty correlate positively, while religion and wealth and happiness correlate negatively. It's a very simplistic, univariate analysis that Thomas performed, and it's flawed. So here's why. He did exclude China, which has 1.4 billion people population. Now we've only got 7 billion people in the world, so that's a pretty significant exclusion. He said he couldn't find relevant data. He also thought Norway was a pretty even swap. Oh, sure. Norway has 5.4 million very homogenous people. That's a real good swap there, Thomas. Norway's GDP per capita is about 77,000 in US dollars per year. That's a lot different than China's GDP per capita, which is much less. It's about a third. He also excluded the United States as an example of a Christian or a religious nation, since a survey found only 65% claimed to be religion. Now note, the US is an exception to the general rule that Western societies are non-religious. We have 330 million people. We are the third largest country in the world. Okay, we're almost as big, if you actually add on just not too much more, the whole EU, all of those countries in the European Union have 446 million inhabitants. Okay, so United States, a pretty big player, and Thomas excluded both the United States and China. China's notably atheistic. Most people in China say they're atheistic because for fear of their government. They might not be honest about that, but that's what they're saying. In fact, in one study I saw from the World Value Surveys, 19% of people in China admitted to believing in God. The other 81% denied that. So as I mentioned here, we've got to include a lot of different factors. Western societies, according to Francis Fukuyama, have their roots in individualism and human dignity. And we've also seen hospitals, universities, property rights, the value of women, the value of all as equally deserving of opportunities, and more are rooted in Christianity. Christian values permeate the constitutions of Germany, South Africa, the United States, the UN, and more. And you can consider some of the non-Christian societies. Another glaring omission in Thomas's assessment was what happened in the last century with the USSR, Cambodia, and China, and how 120 million people perished under those egregious sort of philosophies. Okay, they were run by atheists like Stalin, and the idea was in many cases they were crushing religious institutions, they were crushing the churches, killing people related to the churches, certainly killing the farmers, taking away individual property rights for the value of the greater good. One of the most wondrous things of Christianity is we've gotten away from this idea of for the value of the greater good, to the detriment of the individual. Okay, that's the big thing. It's not just the value of the greater good. It's the communist philosophy is to the detriment of the individual. So if the individual has to give up all of his food for the greater good and starve to death, that was what the communist philosophy believed. Now just go look at the Gulag Archipelago if you have any questions on what I'm saying there. We also have the flaws going on in the Muslim faith, which Thomas kind of equates with the Christian faith. Now, they're two completely different faiths. It speaks to what happened with the Arab Spring and the value of the individual in that culture. They also are looking at the greater good to the detriment of the individual sort of situation. There was a Tunisian street seller who was selling he had a little fruit cart. The government came and took his fruit cart away. That was his only source of income. So he went to complain to the government, and they didn't have an answer for him, and they ignored him essentially. So he lit himself on fire. And that began the Arab Spring because people realized they were on the exact same boat. Their individual rights and values were not given any sort of priority. The value of the community to the detriment of the individual was considered primacy. And again, we've got some other issues. So the risk of spurious findings, what does it mean when I say spurious findings? Okay, when I refer to spurious findings, I am talking about when you put together a univariate analysis, meaning you've got two variables, and that's what Thomas had. He had religiosity as one, and separate analyses of all of these different economic indicators as the second. Okay, that's flawed. Why is it flawed? Because it's like the butterfly effect. There could be a lot of things going on that you have not controlled for. So here are some factors when you're looking at, for example, GDP. And I've looked at a number of different studies to give these factors, and there are more besides what I'm even saying, but levels of freedom in a country, the wealth, actually religiosity correlates directly with wealth, health. Thomas talked a lot about happiness. Well, it just happens to be that countries that have very good medical facilities tend to be healthier, the people tend to be healthier, and when they're healthy, they're also happy. That's how it works. Health and happiness correlate one-on-one very closely. Welfare systems, if we look at Northern Europe and Western Europe, they've got very strong welfare systems, really high taxes, but you're also being provided for as far as universal health care. You get K through 12 education, plus you get education when you're pre-K, and you get education when you're post-K. So you get education also coming into the colleges, a lot of times free in many of these countries. They have very stable political systems, sound property rights, proximity to the equator. Like, what are you talking about? Well, studies have indicated that most countries that are close to the equator, meaning the hotter countries or the most temperate, are not very successful economically for a variety of reasons, but that's actually a factor that needs to be included. A notable exception is Singapore. It's a very temperate climate, but that is one exception, one outlier to the general rule that if you're located close to the equator, your economy probably is not doing so well in general, okay? It's gotten a little bit better since the advent of air conditioning, but if you look over the centuries, that has been a factor in speaking to our economic development. Levels of individualism. United States is the most individualist country in the world. Okay, according to Hofstede and also according to the Globe studies and other studies that have come out since then. What does that mean? We're pretty much all for things like capitalism, entrepreneurship, creativity. Okay, those are very important factors when you're speaking to a gross domestic product. And I'm going to show you the actual numbers in a moment. The other idea is population size. Obviously, a larger population is going to have a bigger potential for higher gross domestic product. If you've got a capitalist society with a big middle class, that's going to be promoted, okay? The United States has been a significant proponent of a significant middle class. And so also another factor that a lot of people point out is natural resources. So you look at countries that have natural resources, for example, a lot of the Arab countries have the resources of oil, and that's helped them out as far as their gross domestic product. You have Norway. One of the reasons Norway, as Thomas mentioned, was so wealthy is because Norway's proximity to oil. Now, Venezuela also has oil, but unfortunately their socialist system blew it. So it's not just natural resources. You have to add in other factors like the form of government in order. Population density is important too. So what is the density? If you tend to notice in the bigger cities, there tends to be a gravitation towards more liberal views, more socialist sorts of views, and in less dense places, you might see more conservatism. National culture is important, regional and local. I'm going to get into that in just a moment, more detail. Social capital, I'm also going to get into that. That's levels of trust. Inflation rate's really important. If you're in a country that has extreme inflation, as we've seen in places like runaway inflation in Bolivia years ago and in Zimbabwe, you got problems. You're not going to be successful. Currency stability, access to education. Now you've still got many places in the world where women are not given equal access to education, particularly in Arab countries. Even in places that you would think would be the more Las Vegas versions of the Arab countries. I had friends go down to the United Arab Emirates a few years back to deliver an experiential education format, and the women and the men were separated in the universities. Women were in one university, men were in another. They have very separate education. They don't put them together. And so that's an issue. In some places like Afghanistan, women are not even given the access to education unless you try to break through and buck the requirement from the Taliban. You've got a lot of problems with that. And when you tell half your population that they can't get educated, you're only going to get half the potential for a good GDP. And of course, the infrastructure. So what's the access to the internet like? What are the roads like? How can you bring products from one place to another? Very important factors in gross domestic product. Now, these were all excluded. As far as contributors to gross domestic product, Thomas basically said, well, religiosity is the contributor to the gross domestic product. You see all these other factors here not included. So these institutions just didn't pop into existence in 2009. They were built over centuries in the West, which was once completely steeped in individualism, values, and human dignities of Christianity. So what's culture? What kind of a difference does culture make? Those are the values that people have. Now, if you value things like innovation and creativity, and your country does too, meaning your leaders, and they allow you to obtain property and to buy and sell goods on a free market, well, then you are going to be motivated to produce. And that's why communism failed. You want to know why communism failed and socialism is a wreck, especially in places like Venezuela? It's because when you take away the desire to achieve and the motivation, and you tell people that everyone gets the same outcome no matter what the inputs are, okay, that's essentially a Marxist philosophy, that is going to go completely against human nature. So if my family is told, okay, each of you can contribute according to your abilities. Say I make 10 baskets, my kids make 1 basket each, my husband makes 30 baskets, and the person who's paying us says, okay, that's equal. We're going to give you each $5. Well, that completely is unfair. That's the bottom line and why communism fails. So society also varies. Now, subcultures also play a role here, so do regional cultures. The EU captures all of European countries, and that plays a big role as far as how things are viewed in the EU. Interesting conversations going on with places like Brexit. And Brexit's about to formally, December is when it's formally going to be separated. There's a lot of stresses surrounding that. We've got a populist local culture in the parts of Great Britain that decided to split from the rest of the EU. And we have the cities like London, people tended to want to stay in the EU. Now, why did the people in the rural areas want to split with the EU? They're afraid of immigration. That's another topic for another day, but immigration can also greatly impact your gross domestic product if suddenly you're taking care of a lot of immigrants, and some of the monies that are produced in the country are going to, say, the hospital fees and that of the people you're bringing in. So here we go. So what are some determinants of culture? These are all factors that do speak to GDP as well. So you can see right here, all sorts of factors, your work location, starting from the beginning, what you're born with, your sexual orientation, gender identity, physical ability, mental ability, your experiences, your family, your religion, I could go on. All of these speak to your culture. Your culture speaks to whether or not you've got a good gross domestic product. Now, some general themes with culture. Power distribution is something to watch. Is it a hierarchical society like us, like South America or China or the Arab countries or African countries? Or is it a more egalitarian society like Northern Europe? Okay, or is it in the middle like the United States? Do people focus on individualism or do they focus on collectivism? If you're over in China, there's a big focus on what they call in-group collectivism, meaning you need to establish relationships with people in China if you want to get things going in China. They have this thing called guanxi. If you don't know the national culture, you don't know the people in China, you're not going to be able to make things happen if you don't have that network of in-group members. Okay, and then in our United States, we tend to be individualist, most individualist society in the world. Germany and Austria also are individualist. Northern Europe tends to have high levels of institutional collectivism. That comes with high levels of social safety nets. And I'm going to get into that and how that impacts religiosity in the first place. It's really interesting how this all plays out. The other thing is uncertainty, avoidance, and social control. You're going to find places that have established a lot of rules for uncertainty. They tend to have higher levels in some cases of conservatism because they want to establish a lot of rules and tend to be dominated in civil law forms like Germany. Tend to also have, because they've established a lot of these rules, because they have high social welfare systems, they've taken away a lot of the role of the church. Hence, you have fewer people going to church, and over time that ends up being a less religious country. And that's what we've seen play out in places like Germany. Also, do we live in harmony with the environment or do we control it? The United States, we feel like we have some mastery. In other countries, they think they live more in harmony, like we can speak to China and the idea of feng shui. The idea of time and work. How do you value time? Okay, in the United States, time is money. Time is of the essence. When watches first came around and the clock was first invented, we suddenly had this drive towards taking time into account in the workplace. And that was able to transform life as we know it, because people suddenly had to be at work at a certain time. It wasn't just a block of time like it used to be in the old days, where you're looking at quadrants in a day of 3-hour spans. Now you're looking at something much more interesting where you're talking about 8 o'clock in the morning. Specifically, you need to be there by 8, not 8:01, 8 o'clock. That's how it works. Okay, so on that note, I'm going to come back. These are some studies, again, talking about these variations with culture. So I'm going to take a break here, come back to what Thomas has to say. I've given you a prelim on some different ideas here. We're going to come back to Thomas in just a moment. First, I'm going to come back to you guys in the chat. Whoops, wait, I don't want you. Hold on, I'm in the wrong one. Okay, coming back to the chat. All right, so I just want to come back. I see Stuart Scott, now we're into remedial communism, completely off topic. No, it actually isn't. Communism is completely on topic for gross domestic product and relationships to religiosity. Dalton says, already explained. All right, so we see some other things. Does anyone have a question or thought before I go on? I want to say thank you to whoever just contributed to, let me just see where that came from. Thank you, Kent Hoven, to celebrate being friends again. Oh, that's so nice of Kent Hoven. I know who he is. Actually, he and I are now, what was he called again? Oh gosh, it's on. I just freed him up on Twitter because he and I were Prince of Pass. That's who he is. So Prince of Pass and I are now buds again. So it's all good. So thank you so much, Prince of Pass. I'm actually showing SD4R because I didn't see his things. So I'm going to be able to come back. I see nobody with a wrench in this group here, unfortunately, to be able to take a look at the chat, which is not good. I might have to make a wrench here. Okay, let's go back to what Thomas has to say on atheism being a downfall, and then I will come back with a little bit more commentary. So here we go. So let's hear Thomas. Let me bring it back up. So here we go, share screen. All right, so back to Thomas Westbrook, the holy Kool-Aid. You guys probably get the play on that. The idea of Kool-Aid, don't drink the Kool-Aid. That's how he ends his videos. Here we go. Okay, so you can see this. Let's go. So you see the factors that he's citing here. And this is why, yes, communism is important to note. The political structure of a country is very important to note if you're going to speak to things such as economic indicators, wealth, income inequality. I mean, clearly, if we're looking at a communistic country, we need to take these things into account. So it's not getting off tangent.
Development and happiness. Well, then compare the results together to see if religion really is necessary for nations to be happy, healthy, wealthy, and safe. Or if when they walk away from their faith, God curses them to disastrous ruin.
Game over.
First, let's look at wealth, measured by GDP per capita. A country's GDP, or gross domestic product, is a measurement of the size of its economy. It's the total value of goods produced and services provided in a country during 1 year. If you divide that by the size of the overall population, you get kind of a rough average estimate of how much wealth a country produces per person in that country. On average, in 2009, the top 20 most religious countries had a GDP per capita of 4,866.4 per year. That's
I think this is actually hilarious. So he's got the reason, I mean, he's essentially looking at all of these countries and not taking into account all of those different factors that I cited that actually really play into a GDP of a country. I mean, clearly we've got our infrastructure, our economic systems, our political systems, whether or not we're capitalist or communist, a market-based society, whether people have freedom, whether people have property rights. I mean, there are a zillion factors almost to talk about a GDP, and he's basically melted it down to one: religiosity. Was just, I mean, when I looked at this, I was like, no, Thomas. And Thomas actually has a degree from Texas A&M in political science, I understand. So I, again, would like to have Thomas on my channel so he can defend himself. I don't want to just talk about Thomas. I did invite him, in case you guys are wondering, twice. Just joined here. I asked him twice on Twitter and once in the comment section on his video, and he did not respond. So he declined, essentially. So let's go.
Well below the poverty line here in the US. By comparison, the non-religious countries on average were 5.84 times as wealthy.
Okay, so again, he's looking at these countries that are also on the fumes of Christianity in many cases. So you'll see right here, the very top country that he has right here, Estonia. Actually, Estonia is not so much, but we got Sweden, Denmark, United Kingdom, France. Those are definitely countries that are on the heels of Christianity. Down below a little bit more, we've got Luxembourg, Germany, and Switzerland. Also, a lot of those European countries tend to have a lot of religiosity. So I'm going to go back, zoom back over here. I'm going to say hello again to the chat, and then I'm going to come back over and show you guys a little bit more of other things that we need to talk about here to really dissect what's going on. I want to make sure you have a full picture on what is going on in this particular thing. So we've got Jesse Camping. Thank you. You're watching this. Just cutting the lawn or watching this. I guess you can't really do both unless you blast it in your ear, right, Jesse? So thank you so much. And so, so I'm going to go back and show you. So he basically made the assessment. I'm not just making this up. He's talking about religiosity being a factor as far as gross domestic product. I'm saying that there's many more factors besides just that. So let's go. So we have other factors that do make a difference. Now, if you go to, whoops, I'm looking at the wrong thing. I don't want to share that. I meant to share the other. Okay, so I mean to share this one. Okay. Okay, so if we go to other factors that make a difference, power distance, again, we're looking at levels of hierarchy versus egalitarianism, individualism versus collectivism. I've mentioned these before. Uncertainty avoidance, in other words, you establish lots of rules, tends to be countries that have lots of rules in place, might end up being more secular and might be less religious. Countries that tend towards what they call femininity tend to be more secular and less religious. That is the idea of having lots of gender egalitarianism, meaning you see a lot of women in higher level roles. Countries that orient themselves towards masculinity, meaning less gender orientation, tend to be more religious. Now, of course, in that pot, we've got places like Muslim countries, and so that might be one of the reasons why we see these relationships. The most masculine country in the world, just so you know, is Japan. Japan is considered the #1 country as far as gender in egalitarianism, meaning that you're not going to find that many Japanese women in higher level positions in organizations that are big. So big companies tend to employ men. I've been told from female friends that when they go over to Japan as an expatriate, they're given some status, but the Japanese women, not so much. Okay, so then we talk about short-term versus long-term orientation. In the West, we tend to have more of a short-term orientation, not necessarily that good. That's not a good factor. In the East, they tend to have more of a long-term orientation. If you look at China right now, they're very patient. They're looking into the distance. They're actually thinking of glomming on to Hong Kong and Taiwan right now. They've decided they want to take those over, and they think that they're going to do so during COVID while we're all distracted. And so keep your eyes on that, because I think that that would not be a good thing for Taiwan or Hong Kong to be subsumed within the Chinese mainland. Completely different cultures right now. Hong Kong and Taiwan, also the other tigers over there, have been quite successful without China, and you're going to see why. They've got very high levels of gross domestic product because they have much more freedom than China mainland has. Again, it's operating under communist philosophy, even though they've opened up to some markets. Then there's this idea of indulgence and restraint. In the United States, we tend to want gratification of everything. We want it now, okay? And in other countries, there's more restraint. That doesn't necessarily speak to religiosity, but it can relate a little bit. So if you go to the Muslim countries, for example, they're restrained as far as alcohol. They won't drink alcohol typically. In many places, they don't have alcohol. And that's just something that's part of the Quran. They have been told not to drink. Okay, that's not changing. All right, so here's just to give you an idea of how this plays out with these different cultural variables. This is sort of a relative scale. So if you look at the United States on this scale, you're going to see in levels of individualism right here, we're at 91, power distance 40. Now that's right around the middle in power distance, individualism very high. You're going to see another country of Australia also having high levels of individualism. And you're going to see masculinity. Now, again, remember that tends to be more religious countries tend to have higher levels of masculinity typically. And that usually means less, more religiosity. However, there are some notable exceptions. Like Japan, you can see here has the highest level of masculinity. They tend not to be terribly religious, although they do have Taoism and Shintoism. We have the long-term orientation. You can see how low we are on that. The United States tends to be more indulgent and focused on the short term. So just see how that works out. Other values that are important to speaking to how our countries have developed and thrived are people's values within these countries. You're going to see in the United States, there's a big focus on the self-enhancement quadrant of power and achievement. In some of the Eastern countries, there's more of a focus on self-transcendence. What's interesting is that when you put these on a scale, they vary around the focus. I mean, it varies on the scale as far as how important these things are. But when they rank ordered them, every country, with very few exceptions, ranked benevolence as number 1 and universalism as number 2. So this idea that we should help the in-group as benevolence is important to everybody, no matter which country you're in. And universalism comes in second. Self-direction comes in third. So other cultural values that speak to gross domestic product, things like our value that we think we can influence the future. We think hard work works, okay? We have the Protestant work ethic. We believe the obligation of an employee is to the organization. A lot of people think it's to friends and family. A lot of people think things like wisdom and luck are more important than the idea of hard work. Employees can be removed if they don't perform well in the United States. That actually would be loss of prestige, especially in formerly communist or communistic countries. Competition stimulates high performance in the United States. We love competition. So does Korea. Korean people, South Koreans, love competition. It tends to lead to an imbalance and disharmony, according to some places. And what works is important, and symbols and process are more important than the end point. So we've just got some different aspects that vary. Now, to speak to Thomas's exclusion of the United States in his analysis of GDP, let's look. In 2019, look who had the highest GDP. With only 330 million people, our GDP in the United States was 21.43 trillion, or 65,000 per capita. The EU, again, they've got more people, about 100 million people more, but yet their GDP is lower. It's 18.29 trillion, and the per capita is only 35,000. China, actually, I was thinking it was at 20,000. No, they're at 10,000. I forgot that. So China at $10,000 per capita. Again, they've got 1.4 billion people. Their GDP is lower than ours. And so you can see right here the value of the hard work ethic, the spirit of capitalism, good systems for entrepreneurship and growth and property rights and human dignity are built into the United States Code, built into our Declaration of Independence and all of our Constitution. It's my understanding that the European Union Constitution is moving away from some of these Christian values that have formed the foundation, which we're all benefiting from. So we'll take a look at that. Now let's look at some other factors from some great economists and other major intellectuals who are thinking about this stuff. Jeffrey Sachs has pointed out, before 1820, there was no such thing as sustained economic growth. The growth of GDP per capita averaged around 0.04% per annum from 1500 to 1820. Okay, so what happened? This is something also Thomas excluded in his analysis. He's not looking at any history. He just took a snapshot of 2009. Since 1820, we've all experienced growth, yet it's been very uneven. The West pulled ahead. In 1990, 21 developed countries were in the West or Western offshoots, and 5 were Asian: Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan. Also, we can add Kuwait, Israel, United Arab Emirates, and Chile also formed this list of developed countries. So some of the factors that Jeffrey Sachs pointed out, and I actually know that Thomas would know who Jeffrey Sachs is because he's very famous. And if you're a person studying the things Thomas has studied, you should know him. Geography, capitalism, and positive feedback in technological innovations. In other words, if you come up with a good technological innovation like the iPhone, we see the consumers glomming onto it, buying it, positive feedback. And the state also, another important thing is social mobility is high. You can move around as you want. You can go to places that are more economically feasible as a person in the United States. You don't need to stick around your poor, terribly horrible area of the country. You can move to a better place if it's not working out for you there. We are bound by the rule of law. Okay, people are considered equal in the eyes of not only the Lord, but equal in the eyes of law. That's something that's part of the United States. We scorn the idea of social class restraints. We like to see people go from rags to riches in the United States. That's another factor that's been really important. Jeffrey Sachs also says in socialist societies, politics is dominated by a repressive, single-party organization. Traditional culture, especially religion, is suppressed, as are all private market activity and accumulation of private wealth. In hindsight, we see that socialism was economically destructive almost everywhere. Of course, he's referring to what I already referred to in the USSR, China, and Cambodia. Marx and Engels surmised correctly that capitalism would eventually spread to the entire world based on the superiority of its economic productivity. It would have been a really good fact for Thomas to include the idea of capitalism. Now, people say, wait a second, capitalism's evil, there's greedy people. Well, that's certainly true, there are greedy people, and that is unfortunately is one negative externality of capitalism. However, capitalism has some very good things for the market. The difference between capitalism and communism is essentially which person has the power, whether it's the businessman or it's the government. The other difference is the government is not motivated as much as a businessman to be efficient. Okay, the government can not be efficient and to squander money from the people, whereas you have to be efficient as a businessman. Big advantage of capitalism over communism. Okay, so modern capitalism began in societies like England and Holland, and it spread to North America, Australia, and New Zealand. So this idea of capitalism and the history we have in that is what speaks to the current success that we've seen in these countries. We have Christianity now. What did Christianity say about capitalism? Let's go back to the parable of the talents. Let's invest in our spiritual gifts. That's basically what Jesus said. In the parable of the talents, he spoke of 3 people working for someone, and the person they were working for, the master, gave the first person 10 pieces of gold, essentially, or whatever it was. The second one got 5 pieces. The third one got 1 piece. The first one invested the money and came back with more gold. The second one invested, came back with more. In both cases, the master said, "Well done, good and faithful servant." The third one buried his talents. And when he came back, the master scorned him. He didn't like that. You're supposed to use your talents and use your gifts. Proverbs has it littered all over the place that you're supposed to work hard. It leads to prosperity, and we don't like laziness. People who point out that in the very early church, we saw some, what they might view as more of a socialist idea, that people were giving into the church no matter what they came up with. That is true. Socialism can work in very small levels. In other words, we have socialism in our family. My kids don't work like I do. I give all of my income to the family that and my husband gives his income to the family, but kids aren't putting in the money. Socialism does work in small little groups of people. Once you get bigger, it doesn't work. So we're talking about big countries, nation states. We don't see socialism work like it would work at the micro family level, or even at the level of maybe a handful of families, which is why you see some of those little communes working in some places of the world, like in Israel. They do work at very small numbers of people, but once you get bigger and we start seeing uneven contributions, then we have problems. So Jeffrey Sachs has said, it has been argued that modern economic growth is intimately connected with capitalist institutions and favorable geography. I mentioned that before, the idea of having river streams, outlets in history, being able to ship products was really important. And so you wanted access to the water in the past. An example of a country that is not fitting into that whole mindset is Switzerland, but Switzerland was able to capitalize on its intellectual prowess and develop watches. So even though they were landlocked, they were able to break free. But they're an outlier. They're an exception to the rule. Most countries did have some way to get out onto the water and ship products, and that helped. There's only slight evidence. Now here, Thomas, I hope you're listening. Slight evidence that religious categories add explanatory power above those 2 broad classes of explanation of economic growth. So there, Jeffrey Sachs just took down Thomas's whole assertion, okay? Some factors. Now, you're saying to yourself, now, why is it that some of these countries that Thomas did name, especially some of the African countries, why have they had such challenges? It doesn't speak to religiosity as much as it speaks to just their culture. Okay, so Daniel Atunga Menguel, in his analysis of African culture, has noted that poverty is attributable to the following. They have a highly centralized and vertical traditions of authority, okay, lots of hierarchy. They focused on the past and the present, not so much planning for the future. There's a big focus on the past and the present. They reject the tyranny of time. Remember when I said in the United States, we say time is money? They don't like that idea, okay? Time is very relative to them. They don't have this philosophy of you're wasting my time, and they don't like being held to time constraints. And this is, of course, this is in general. I'm sure you can find people in that population or those populations that are exceptions to those rules. This is a general ethos of the entire region, as assessed by this intellectual, Daniel Itunga Menguel. There's a distaste for work. You work to live, but you don't necessarily live to work. And there's a suppression of individual initiative, achievement, and saving. And also, according to Danielle, there is a jealousy of success. And then there's this belief in sorcery that also unfortunately nurtures irrationality and fatalism. All right, so that's correlating with some of the reasons why we have a lower GDP in these African countries. Now, why is it lower in South America? Now we have a South American expert weighing in here. Carlos Alberto Montaner has said the elites have held South America back. He says these elites are categorized as follows. Politicians, he said a big problem with them is corruption and clientelism. The latter is when the public funds the buying of votes from large blocks of people. The military has been stepping in invasive ways. They've imposed their visions of social justice against politicians and have traditionally taken over in many places through the years. Businessmen, now rather than risking in innovation, creativity, and projects that would enhance the market, they instead use a very risk-averse approach where they speculate on real estate and they sit on it for years and years and years, and that doesn't really do much to enhance prosperity in a region. The clergy, now this does speak to Thomas's idea, but the ones who preach against market economics, they tend to be a big problem down there. And we do see that. We've got a very large presence in South America of the Catholic Church, and we have some members of clergy who have essentially they're socialist, communist sorts of people. They don't like free market economies, and we did see how that plays out. Jeffrey Sachs, again, capitalism, really important. The intellectuals, those communist, socialist types of intellectuals are a big problem. Okay, the anti-West, anti-Yankee, and anti-market people, not so good. And then, of course, the left, people who advocate unions that oppose privatization. What's the opposite of privatization? Nationalization. So in our United States, I can go and form my own business and I don't have to worry that the government is going to take it over and what they call nationalize my business. Now, in Venezuela, that's exactly what the government did. They nationalized many businesses, took over many people's entire lifelong quest for making money, their little businesses. The government took over big businesses, took over other businesses, smaller businesses, and a lot of people fled. Got neighbors who fled from there. So other factors globally. Okay, Francis Fukuyama, he goes by Frank. He talks a lot about social capital. Now, if you go to the World Value Surveys, and Thomas might want to note, this is a longitudinal survey starting in 1981. They've got about 6 waves of data collections since that time. They've noticed changes in population values over those times. And Francis Fukuyama pointed out the strength of family bonds differs from society to society. It also varies relative to other types of social obligation. In China and Latin America, families are strong and cohesive. Now, as I mentioned before, those 2 countries are high in in-group collectivism. So here's the clincher. But it is hard to trust strangers. You see, again, high and in-group usually means to the exclusion of the out-group. And levels of honesty and cooperation in public life are much lower. A consequence is nepotism, which is favoring your family in hiring positions, and pervasive public corruption. What made the Protestant Reformation important for Weber, Max Weber they're referring to, that German who wrote this great book called The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, was not so much that it encouraged honesty, reciprocity, and thrift among individual entrepreneurs, but that these virtues were for the first time widely practiced outside of the family. Max Weber is one of the first people that we study in business management, and it's in management principles classes that people first learn about him. He talks a lot about promoting people based on their performance instead of based on their family relationships. And this idea was brand new in the turn of the last century. It's a big deal to think that way because for centuries, people were basically promoting family and friends and not promoting people based on impersonal factors like your work. So Thomas Westbrook's overly simplistic univariate analysis of the economic and sociocultural correlates of societal religiosity ignores a multitude of historical, economic, political, and sociocultural factors, rendering spurious results. Western societies benefit from the hard work of our Christian ancestors who established the rules of law, human dignity, individualism, free markets, social capital, and more. These factors led us to where we are today. I'm going to come back into the chat and see if you guys have any thoughts or questions on this topic. So I'm back here now, and I see Jesse Camping, and I see Stuart Scott talking about 1991, not sure why. So do you have any questions here? And yes, I'm a professor. Here's what I teach, in case you're wondering. I teach business management. My PhD, which I received in 2007 from Florida Atlantic University, is in business. It's in business administration with specializations in international business and in human resource management. Taking the two together, I studied a lot of stuff with cross-cultural relations, cross-cultural psychology. I studied just world events, macroeconomic factors. We studied a little bit in economics. We did a lot of studies on, I took multiple classes on cultures. It was a big thing. I also teach in human resource management. I teach ethics. That's a big focus. Ethical decision-making, variations again by national cultures, local cultures, and regional cultures. And yeah, I see Jesse Camping is actually taking a screenshot of what I'm teaching. Yes, I've taught all those classes. Essentials of Corporate Responsibility is one I wish I could teach again. I haven't taught that in a long time because we changed our 3-credit to 4-credit model. So thank you so much. So yeah, these are my topics. This is what I teach. And that's why I was so excited to bring this forward to you today. I hope that what I've shared with you is going to make a difference when you're talking to people who take these simple views of what's going on in the world by saying, okay, hey, look, all the African countries, they tend to be more poor in many of these countries, and they also tend to be highly religious. Accordingly, it must mean that because they're religious, they're poor. Now, I have to, in all fairness to Thomas, he did not say it was a causal relationship. However, he implied that in his correlations by looking at the top 20 one way and the top 20 the other way. And so that was a big factor there. So I want to invite people here to ask me any questions if you want to tag me, thoughts, questions. If Thomas is in here, I don't think he is, but if he is, or if he goes to listen to this, I would love to chat with you more on this. I have much more information that I've shared here that we can get into. And I would highly recommend a few books where I've drawn some of this information. So one of the books where I've drawn the information contains a number of intellectuals from a Harvard meeting that occurred in the late 90s. It's called Culture Matters. It's written by a couple of people. One of them is called Harrison, and I'm forgetting the other one's name for some reason all of a sudden, but it contains people like Francis Fukuyama, Jeffrey Sachs, Lipset, and a number of different people who've got a lot of high-level positions and high-level philosophies on different topics. And so I would highly recommend that book. I'd also recommend the book by Hofstede called Culture's Consequences. He collected data from IBM around the world in the late 60s and early 70s, and he classified people as into different cultures as a function of which values they held to be the most important. A follow-up study to that was the Globe study in 2004, and both studies and Hofstede's study that came out after that. He also took his study and compared it with current studies, and Hofstede found that there were a lot of current studies that came out that verified what he found in the late 70s or late 60s also worked out today. Jesse Camping says, because I am Canadian. Why was our dollar higher than yours in the 70s and the US didn't like it? Lol. That's a great question. I'm not sure why your dollar was higher than ours in the 70s. I actually haven't even looked into that why the 70s. But that's interesting. So yeah, as long as I've known, anytime I've priced out the Canadian dollar, it's always done better than the United States dollar. I can say that Canada is interesting. It's 25 million people in Canada. It's the second largest in space country in the world, and it's behind California. California has 29 million people in smaller geography, so it's kind of interesting. Canada is an interesting place, a little mini US in a way. And then Susan says, do you know the ethnicities in America that make more than Caucasians? Well, sure I do. Over 10 of them. No, I didn't know that. So I know that make more, I'm assuming more money than the Caucasians. Well, we know that a lot of Asians, and if she's breaking down Asians by different ethnic groups within the Asian group, I'm sure that's part of it. And then also, of course, the Ashkenazi Jews also tend to make more money on average. So we've got a couple of different ethnicities or different groups that tend to make more money than Caucasians. And it also aligns directly with IQ levels. Their IQ levels tend to be higher in the IQ tests from those particular groups. In fact, the Ashkenazi Jew has the highest average IQ in the world when they do these IQ tests, followed by the East Asians. And so East Asians also tend to have pretty high IQs. And so that's, yeah, Jesse Camping, that's funny. Oh, am I wrong? If I'm wrong, Susan, please do show if I'm wrong about that. So I thought I saw studies where I've seen those groups doing better, but I could be wrong. So let's see what Susan has to say on that. So I also want to comment that, so I mentioned those few books. Other people that I would mention, I do a lot of binge YouTube video listening, and I listen to Francis Fukuyama a lot. He's been saying a lot lately. He's talked a lot about Donald Trump, and he's talked a lot about what he calls populism. And he feels like one of the reasons why Donald Trump is really important is because he's speaking to a certain populist level of the country that feel that they've been left behind. And one of the reasons that they feel left behind is because there's been this identity politics where people are focusing on other aspects of the country. There are 2 African groups. I did not split the Asians up. Okay, good. So there's a couple of groups that are, so yeah, I have to see. Susan, if you have a link to that study or you want to talk about where that came from, I'd love to go see that. So I'm not following income levels as much as I should be probably. So anyway, I want to say thank you everybody for coming in here. I hope that you'll like and subscribe, and please do come again. Susan's going to go back and find them. Yeah, I'd love to see that. So that sounds really interesting stuff. And so I'm going to be back on the next thing I have planned is the 14th. So the 14th is a big thing. On the 14th, I'm going to have a former Miss Texas. Her name is Lori Morrow. She's got the spoon-fed soul, and she and I are going to talk about social justice issues. And then on the 16th, I've got Michael Heiser, Dr. Michael Heiser, and we're going to talk a lot about his books, The Unseen Realm and Reversing Herman, and some other books. And so anyway, I want to say thank you everybody for coming in here. And thank you, Stuart. Scott is also in here. I haven't seen him in a while. Thank you, Jesse Camping, Susan, and Joseph Turcott. I really love seeing you guys. Please do come again. And also thank you, Dalton Horton and SD4R. Lots of great stuff. So you guys have a great afternoon. Have a great weekend. Wonderful times. I'm probably going to get back in here definitely before the 14th. I just have to think of a topic. If I see any more videos by Thomas Westbrook, I might just have to do those because I was so fascinated when I listened to his video. So please like, subscribe, and do come again. Bye-bye.